The woman on the phone said something that made absolutely no sense to me. "I'm so sorry, Miss Bennett, but your deposit was already transferred. The date's been reassigned." My name is Olivia. I was 29 years old, sitting at my desk during my lunch break, holding my phone so tightly my knuckles had turned white, trying to understand how the $8,000 deposit I had personally paid for my wedding venue had somehow ended up reassigned to an entirely different bride. I asked the coordinator to repeat herself, certain I had misunderstood. I hadn't. "Your sister called last week," she explained carefully, clearly sensing my confusion. "She said she was handling the account on your behalf, that there'd been a change of plans, and that the deposit needed to be transferred to her own booking instead. She had all your account information. We assumed it was authorized." I sat there in stunned silence, my lunch growing cold in front of me, slowly piecing together the fact that my own sister, Brooke, had somehow convinced my wedding venue to hand over my deposit, my date, and my carefully planned wedding day, all without saying a single word to me about it. What I didn't know yet, sitting frozen at my desk that afternoon, was that within just 6 weeks, that same sister was going to call me with a bright, cheerful voice and ask me to stand beside her, as her maid of honor, at the very wedding she had just built on top of the ashes of mine. I want to walk you through exactly how this happened, because I think the quiet, careful way I eventually responded matters just as much as the shocking betrayal itself. Brooke and I had always been close growing up, despite being only 18 months apart in age, close enough that people often mistook us for twins, and different enough that our personalities rarely clashed the way many siblings do. I was the steady one, the planner, the one who color-coded my calendar and paid bills 3 days before they were due. Brooke was spontaneous, charismatic, the kind of person who lit up every room she entered, though also, if I'm being fully honest, someone who had struggled throughout her adult life with financial discipline and a persistent habit of expecting things to simply work out, regardless of how carefully or carelessly she planned for them. Our parents, kind but perhaps overly permissive with Brooke throughout our childhood, had developed a pattern over the years of quietly smoothing over her financial missteps, covering a missed rent payment here, an overdue credit card bill there, always with the gentle explanation that Brooke's just going through a rough patch. I didn't resent this dynamic particularly, at least not consciously. I built my own financial stability carefully, methodically, working as a project manager at a mid-sized engineering firm, saving diligently, building the kind of secure, independent life I genuinely took pride in. When I got engaged to my partner, Marcus, after 4 wonderful years together, I felt an enormous sense of joy and anticipation. We began planning our wedding carefully, thoughtfully, exactly the way I approached most significant decisions in my life. Brooke, coincidentally, got engaged just 4 months after I did, to her own longtime boyfriend, Tyler. I remember feeling genuinely thrilled for her, imagining, naively, that we might even enjoy planning our respective weddings alongside each other, sharing vendor recommendations, swapping ideas, supporting one another through the process. I had no idea, at the time, exactly how complicated that overlapping timeline would eventually become. About 6 months into wedding planning, I found the perfect venue, a beautiful, rustic barn property just outside the city, with rolling hills and string lights, and exactly the intimate, romantic atmosphere Marcus and I had always envisioned for our wedding day. The venue required a substantial deposit to secure our preferred date, a Saturday in early October that I had specifically chosen to honor the anniversary of Marcus's parents, who had passed away several years earlier. I paid that deposit myself, using savings I had carefully built over several years specifically for wedding expenses, feeling an overwhelming sense of excitement and relief at having secured such a meaningful, beautiful location for our celebration. I mentioned the venue enthusiastically to Brooke during one of our regular phone calls, sharing photos, describing the rolling hills and the string lights, genuinely excited to share this milestone with my sister. "It's gorgeous, Liv," she said, sounding genuinely happy for me. "You guys are going to have the most beautiful wedding." I had no reason, at that point, to suspect anything beyond genuine sisterly enthusiasm in her response. But roughly 2 months later, Brooke mentioned, during another casual phone call, that she and Tyler were struggling to find a venue within their budget for their own upcoming wedding, which they'd tentatively planned for the following spring. "Everything gorgeous is either already booked or completely outside what Tyler and I can actually afford," she said, her voice carrying a note of genuine frustration. "I don't know what we're going to do." I offered sympathy, genuinely wanting to help my sister find something beautiful within her own means. I had no idea, at the time, that she had already begun quietly exploring an entirely different, far more troubling solution to her venue problem. Looking back now, I recognize several small warning signs I simply failed to notice during that period, distracted as I was by the excitement of my own wedding planning process. Brooke began asking increasingly detailed questions about my venue arrangement, questions about the deposit amount, the payment structure, whether the venue allowed date changes or transfers under certain circumstances. I answered her questions honestly, without much suspicion, assuming she was simply curious about venue logistics as she continued searching for her own location. "Does the venue require you to personally handle all the payment details?" she asked during one conversation. "Or could someone else, like a family member, technically manage that on your behalf if you were busy?" "I handle it myself," I said, somewhat confused by the specific nature of her question. "Why do you ask?" "Just curious," she said, a little too quickly. "Wedding planning is so complicated. I'm trying to understand how it all works." I let the conversation drop, still not fully registering the significance of what she was actually asking. About 3 weeks later, Brooke mentioned, almost offhandedly, that she and Tyler had found a great solution for their venue troubles, though she remained vague about the specific details. "We're really excited," she said. "I'll tell you more once everything's fully confirmed." I remember feeling genuinely happy for her in that moment, relieved that her venue frustrations had apparently resolved themselves. I had absolutely no idea, at the time, exactly what great solution she was actually referring to. The full truth came to light entirely by accident, roughly 2 months later, when I called my own venue coordinator to finalize some remaining details for our upcoming tasting appointment. That's when she informed me, with clear confusion in her voice, that my scheduled date had already been reassigned weeks earlier. "I'm sorry, Miss Bennett," she said, "but your deposit was already transferred. The date's been reassigned to a different booking." I felt the floor seem to tilt slightly beneath me. "Transferred? Reassigned? I never authorized anything like that." "Your sister called about 6 weeks ago," the coordinator explained, clearly growing uncomfortable as she recognized my genuine shock and confusion. "She had your account information, your confirmation number, even personal details about your original booking. She explained that there had been a change in plans, that you needed to reschedule to a later date, but that your original October date needed to be transferred instead to a different couple's booking, since you'd apparently decided you no longer needed it." "That's not true," I said, my voice shaking now with a mixture of confusion and rising anger. "I never spoke to anyone about transferring or canceling anything." The coordinator was quiet for a moment. "I'm terribly sorry, Miss Bennett. We had no reason to suspect the call wasn't legitimate. She had all the correct account details." "Whose booking was my date transferred to?" I asked, though some sinking, dreadful part of me already suspected the answer. There was a brief pause before she answered. "A Brooke Bennett Hayes. I believe she mentioned she was your sister." I sat in stunned, disbelieving silence after that call ended, staring blankly at my computer screen, trying desperately to process what I had just learned. My own sister had somehow gathered enough personal information about my wedding booking to convincingly impersonate me, or at least convincingly claim authorization on my behalf, in order to transfer my venue deposit and my carefully chosen wedding date directly to her own booking. I called Marcus immediately, my voice trembling as I explained what had happened. "She did what?" he said, his own voice sharp with disbelief and anger. Olivia, that's not just a misunderstanding. That sounds like actual fraud. I need to call her, I said, my hands shaking as I scrolled through my contacts to find Brooke's number. I need to understand what's actually going on before I jump to conclusions. But even as I said those words, some quiet, painful part of me already understood exactly what had happened, and exactly why. I called Brooke that same afternoon, my heart pounding as I waited for her to answer. Hey, Liv, she said cheerfully, apparently completely unaware of what I'd just learned. What's up? Brooke, I said carefully, forcing my voice to remain steady despite the anger and hurt churning inside me. I just got off the phone with my venue coordinator. She told me my October date was transferred to your booking. Can you explain that to me? There was a long, telling silence on the other end of the line. Okay, she finally said, her cheerful tone shifting into something more defensive. I can explain, but I need you to not overreact before you hear me out. I'm listening, I said, my voice tight with barely controlled emotion. Tyler and I were completely priced out of every venue we looked at, she began. And I knew your date was already secured, already paid for. I figured, since you and Marcus could probably push your wedding back a few months without much trouble, it made more sense for Tyler and me to take that date instead, since our own timeline felt more urgent given some other factors. What other factors? I asked, genuinely confused. Another uncomfortable pause. Tyler's grandmother is sick, Liv, really sick. We wanted to make sure she could still attend our wedding, and the doctors weren't optimistic about her making it much longer. I panicked, honestly. I called the venue, explained I was your sister, said there'd been a change of plans, and I guess I implied you'd already agreed to the transfer, even though we hadn't actually discussed it yet. I sat with Brooke's explanation for a long moment, feeling a complicated, painful mixture of genuine sympathy for Tyler's grandmother's health, and simultaneous, undeniable fury at exactly how my sister had chosen to handle this situation. Brooke, I said slowly, I understand wanting to make sure Tyler's grandmother can attend your wedding. That's a genuinely difficult, painful situation. But you didn't ask me. You didn't explain any of this to me directly. You called my venue, impersonated my authorization, and took my date, my deposit, and my wedding plans without a single conversation beforehand. I know it wasn't exactly the right way to handle it, she admitted, though her tone still carried more defensiveness than genuine remorse. But I panicked, Liv. I didn't have time to sit down and have a whole big conversation about it, and honestly, I figured you'd understand, given the circumstances. I might have understood, I said, my voice trembling now with barely restrained anger, if you had actually asked me. If you had called me and said, Liv, Tyler's grandmother is sick and we're desperate, could we possibly discuss taking your date instead? I would have listened. I might have even said yes, depending on the circumstances, but you didn't give me that chance. You made the decision for me and then hoped I simply wouldn't notice or wouldn't mind once I eventually found out. Brooke was quiet for a long moment. I'm sorry, Liv, I really am. I know I handled it badly. What about my deposit? I asked. The $8,000 I paid. Another uncomfortable pause. The venue applied it directly to our new booking, she admitted. I don't actually have the cash available to repay you directly, at least not right now. I felt something cold and clarifying settle deep within my chest at those words. I want to be completely honest about the days that followed that conversation, because I think they matter significantly for understanding everything that happened afterward. I was devastated, genuinely heartbroken over losing the specific venue and date that had held such deep, personal significance for Marcus and me. But beneath that immediate grief, an even more painful realization was slowly crystallizing. Brooke hadn't simply made an impulsive, poorly considered decision under pressure. She had specifically, deliberately gathered enough information about my account to convincingly impersonate my authorization, banking, quite literally, on the assumption that I would either not notice, or would simply absorb the loss quietly, the way I had absorbed so many of her financial missteps throughout our lives together, without ever directly benefiting from that pattern myself. I called our parents that evening, hopping, perhaps naively, for some clear acknowledgement of how seriously inappropriate Brooke's actions had actually been. My mother's response, though not entirely surprising given our family's history, still stung sharply. "Olivia, sweetheart, I understand you're upset," she said carefully, "but you have to remember Tyler's grandmother is genuinely ill. I know it wasn't handled perfectly, but surely you can find a way to be understanding, given the circumstances." "Mom," I said, my voice tight with frustration, "Brooke didn't simply handle this imperfectly. She impersonated my authorization to steal my venue booking and my deposit. That's not a minor miscommunication. That's a serious, deliberate betrayal." My mother sighed heavily. "I know it feels that way right now, Olivia, but please, try not to let this create permanent damage between you and your sister. Family is more important than a venue booking, however frustrating the situation might be." I hung up the phone that evening feeling profoundly alone, recognizing, with painful clarity, exactly the familiar pattern unfolding once again. Brooke's financial missteps quietly excused and absorbed, while my own legitimate grievances were gently, persistently minimized in the name of preserving family harmony. I didn't respond impulsively during those following days, despite the overwhelming urge to do exactly that. I needed time to think clearly, to separate my genuine grief over losing our venue from the equally important question of how I intended to handle Brooke's behavior moving forward. Marcus, thankfully, offered steady, clear-eyed support throughout this difficult period. "Whatever you decide," he said gently, "I'll support you completely, but I don't think you should simply pretend this didn't happen just to keep the peace." I ultimately found us a different venue, smaller, less elaborate than our original choice, but still genuinely beautiful, with an available date in early November instead of our originally planned October weekend. It wasn't exactly what we had envisioned, but it allowed us to move forward without further complications. I also made a clear, deliberate decision about how I intended to handle my relationship with Brooke moving forward, at least for the immediate future. I called her about a week after our initial confrontation, my voice calm but firm. "Brooke," I said, "I've had time to think clearly about everything that happened. I want you to understand something important. I'm not interested in dramatic confrontation or in punishing you indefinitely for this. But I do need clear boundaries moving forward, given what you did." "Okay," she said cautiously. "What kind of boundaries?" "First," I said, "I need you to fully acknowledge, without minimizing or justifying it further, exactly what you did. Not simply I handled it badly, but a genuine, direct acknowledgement that you deliberately misrepresented yourself to take something that wasn't yours to take." There was a long pause. "You're right," she finally said, her voice quieter now, more genuinely reflective. "I did exactly that. I panicked, and instead of being honest with you, I took the easier path of just handling it myself, hoping you'd eventually forgive me once you found out. Second," I continued, "I need a real plan for repaying the deposit, even if it takes time. Not vague promises, but an actual, concrete plan." "I can do that," she said. "I'll figure something out, even if it takes a while." I want to pause here, because I think it's important to clarify something about what came next, given everything that had just happened. About 5 weeks after that initial confrontation, once Brooke and Tyler's own wedding planning had progressed significantly, using the venue and date that had originally belonged to Marcus and me, Brooke called me with a bright, hopeful tone that immediately put me on guard. "Liv," she said cheerfully, "I wanted to ask you something really important. Would you be my maid of honor?" I sat in stunned silence for a long moment, genuinely uncertain how to respond to such an unexpected, almost surreal request. "Brooke," I finally said carefully, "you're asking me to stand beside you, celebrating your wedding at the venue and on the date that was originally mine, which you took without asking me directly." "I know it's complicated," she said quickly, her voice carrying a note of genuine hurt now. "But you're still my sister, Liv. I want you standing beside me on my wedding day, regardless of everything else that's happened." I felt a complicated, painful mixture of emotions rising within me: continued love for my sister, genuine hurt over everything that had happened, and a clear, unmistakable recognition that agreeing to this request, without any further acknowledgement or resolution, would simply continue the same painful pattern that had defined our relationship for years. "I need to think about this," I said honestly. "I can't simply say yes right now, given everything that's happened." I spent several days genuinely wrestling with Brooke's request, weighing my authentic love for my sister against the very real, unresolved hurt still lingering from her actions. I called Danielle a close friend of mine, an attorney by profession, whose steady, clear-eyed perspective I'd come to deeply value over the years, needing someone to help me think through the situation clearly. "Olivia," she said carefully after I explained everything, "I think you're facing two separate questions here, and it's important not to conflate them. First, do you genuinely want to participate in Brooke's wedding, given everything that's happened? And second, regardless of your answer to that first question, has Brooke actually taken meaningful, concrete steps to repair the harm she caused you?" "She hasn't repaid anything yet," I admitted. "She said she'll figure out a plan, but nothing concrete has actually happened." "Then I think," Danielle said gently, "your answer to her maid of honor request needs to be directly connected to that unresolved harm. Not necessarily punitive, but honest. You can genuinely love your sister and still recognize that participating fully in her celebration, without any acknowledgement or resolution of what she took from you, would mean quietly absorbing that harm all over again." Her words helped clarify my own thinking considerably. I called Brooke a few days later, my voice steady and clear. "Brooke," I said, "I've thought carefully about your request. I do love you, and I don't want to create permanent damage between us. But I can't fully say yes to being your maid of honor, celebrating wholeheartedly by your side, while the harm from what you did remains completely unresolved." "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice tight with a mixture of hurt and defensiveness. "I mean," I said carefully, "that I need to see genuine, concrete steps toward repayment before I can fully participate in celebrating your wedding without complicated resentment lingering beneath the surface. That's not about punishing you indefinitely. It's about basic fairness and acknowledgement." There was a long, uncomfortable silence on the line. "I don't have $8,000 sitting around, Liv. You know that." "I understand that," I said gently. "I'm not asking for it all at once. I'm asking for a genuine Plan A payment schedule, even a small one, that demonstrates real accountability rather than just hopping I'll eventually let it go without any resolution." Brooke was quiet for a long moment. "I'll talk to Tyler," she finally said. "We'll figure something out." Over the following 2 weeks, Brooke and Tyler worked out a modest but genuine repayment plan, $500 monthly, beginning immediately after their wedding, until the full $8,000 was repaid. It wasn't a perfect resolution. It didn't erase the pain of losing our originally planned venue and date, but it represented genuine, concrete accountability, rather than the vague, unresolved promises that had defined so many of Brooke's previous financial missteps throughout our lives. Once that repayment plan was firmly established, I made my decision regarding her maid of honor request. "Brooke," I told her, "I'm willing to be part of your wedding, but not as maid of honor. I think, given everything that's happened, it makes more sense for me to be a bridesmaid this time, rather than standing in the most prominent celebratory role beside you." She was quiet for a moment, clearly processing this compromise. "I understand," she finally said. "Honestly, that feels fair given everything." I want to be clear about something important here. This wasn't about punishing Brooke indefinitely or refusing genuine reconciliation. It was about establishing a boundary that reflected honest acknowledgement of what had actually happened, rather than simply pretending everything remained exactly as it had been before her betrayal. I want to pause here, because I think it's important to clarify something about what revenge genuinely meant within this particular story. I never sought public humiliation or dramatic confrontation against Brooke. I didn't refuse to attend her wedding or use the occasion to publicly air our unresolved grievances. I simply established clear, honest boundaries, allowing natural consequences, Brooke's own responsibility for genuine repayment, and my own honest recalibration of trust to unfold organically, rather than through any deliberate, punitive scheme on my part. Brooke and Tyler's wedding took place on the November date, at the venue that had originally belonged to Marcus and me. I attended as a bridesmaid, genuinely present and supportive, though carrying, admittedly, a complicated undercurrent of emotion throughout the celebration. Tyler's grandmother, thankfully, was able to attend, looking frail but genuinely joyful throughout the ceremony. Seeing her there, celebrating alongside her family, helped me hold space for genuine compassion regarding the circumstances that had originally motivated Brooke's poor decision, even while maintaining my own boundaries regarding how that decision had actually been executed. During the reception, Brooke pulled me aside for a quiet moment, away from the main celebration. "Thank you for being here," she said, her voice genuinely emotional. "I know things have been complicated between us, but I'm really grateful you didn't just walk away completely." "I love you, Brooke," I said honestly. "That's never been in question, but I needed you to understand, clearly, that love doesn't mean I'll simply absorb harm without any acknowledgement or accountability." She nodded slowly. "I understand that now, more than I did before. I think, honestly, this whole situation taught me something important about the difference between assuming people will understand versus actually communicating honestly, even when it's uncomfortable." Marcus and I had our own wedding 3 weeks later, at our slightly smaller, though genuinely beautiful, alternative venue. It wasn't the exact wedding we had originally envisioned, but it was authentically, completely ours, built without any shadow of unresolved resentment hanging over the celebration. Brooke attended, along with Tyler, genuinely present and supportive throughout our own special day. She made a point, during her own quiet moment with me before the ceremony began, to reaffirm her commitment to the repayment plan we'd established. "I know this isn't the venue you originally wanted," she said softly, tears forming in her eyes. "I'm so sorry, Liv, for everything I put you through." "I know," I said, and I genuinely meant it. "But we found something beautiful anyway, and I think, honestly, we're both learning something important through all of this." Over the following year, Brooke maintained her repayment plan consistently, without a single missed payment. The full $8,000 was fully repaid within 16 months, exactly as she and Tyler had originally committed to. More significantly, though, our relationship gradually rebuilt itself on a foundation of much clearer, more honest communication than had ever existed between us previously. Brooke began actively checking in with me before making decisions that might affect me, rather than simply assuming I would understand and forgive after the fact. I, in turn, found myself more willing to directly express concerns or boundaries, rather than quietly absorbing discomfort the way I had throughout so much of our shared history. About 18 months after her wedding, Brooke called me with news that genuinely moved me. "Liv," she said, "I wanted you to be the first to know. Tyler and I are having a baby, and I wanted to ask, when the time comes, would you be willing to be the godmother?" I felt genuine warmth settle in my chest at her request, recognizing, clearly, how far our relationship had traveled since that painful initial betrayal. "I would be honored," I said honestly, meaning every word completely. During a family gathering nearly 2 years after the original incident, Brooke raised an unexpected toast during dinner, addressing our small, gathered family directly. "I want to say something," she said, her voice steady but emotional. "2 years ago, I made a decision that deeply hurt someone I love more than almost anyone else in this world. I took something that wasn't mine to take, and I justified it to myself in ways that, looking back, were completely unfair to Olivia. I'm endlessly grateful that she was strong enough to hold me accountable, rather than simply letting me continue that pattern indefinitely." She turned toward me directly. "You taught me something important about what real love and real boundaries actually look like, working together. Thank you for not giving up on our relationship, even when I gave you every reason to." I felt tears forming in my own eyes, genuine warmth finally settling completely within my chest. "To family," I said quietly, raising my own glass. The honest kind, built on genuine accountability rather than simply avoiding uncomfortable conversations. I think often about that phone call from my venue coordinator, the confusion and disbelief I felt discovering that my own sister had quietly, deliberately taken something that belonged entirely to me. For most of my life, I believed that loving my sister meant simply absorbing her financial missteps, the way our family had always done, without ever directly expecting the same consideration in return. But I learned something important through this experience, something I carry with me still. Genuine love doesn't require you to quietly absorb harm without acknowledgement or accountability. Family loyalty shouldn't mean automatically excusing behavior simply because addressing it honestly feels uncomfortable or risks temporary tension. Boundaries, I've come to understand clearly, aren't the opposite of love. They're actually one of love's clearest, most honest expressions, particularly within family relationships where old patterns of unequal accountability can persist for years, unchallenged, simply because challenging them feels difficult. I didn't establish those boundaries with Brooke to punish her, or to seek dramatic revenge for what she'd taken. I established them because continuing to simply absorb the harm, without any acknowledgement or accountability, would have taught both of us exactly the wrong lesson that genuine love means unconditional tolerance for behavior that causes real, tangible harm. Instead, that difficult, necessary boundary ultimately created space for something far more valuable to emerge between us: a relationship built on honest communication and genuine accountability, rather than unspoken assumptions and quietly accumulated resentment. That's the lesson I want to leave you with today. If you're someone who has spent years quietly absorbing harm from someone you love, simply because addressing it honestly feels uncomfortable or risks temporary family tension, I hope this story reminds you of an important truth. You are allowed to expect genuine accountability, even from the people you love most. You are allowed to establish clear boundaries without abandoning the love you authentically feel for them. And sometimes, the most loving thing you can do for yourself, and even for the people who have caused you genuine harm, is to hold them accountable clearly and honestly, rather than simply allowing painful patterns to continue indefinitely, unaddressed. Because in the end, the relationships that truly last aren't built on unconditional, unacknowledged forgiveness. They're built on honesty, genuine accountability, and the courage to expect, and ultimately receive, exactly the respect real love actually requires. If this story resonated with you, if it reminded you of the importance of boundaries, accountability, or honest communication within your own family relationships, share it with someone who might need to hear it today. And remember, the next time someone you love takes something that isn't theirs to take, whether through convenience, panic, or simple entitlement, you don't have to simply absorb that harm quietly. Sometimes, the most powerful thing you can do is calmly, clearly, ask for the accountability real love actually requires. This story is inspired by real experiences. We believe every story carries a lesson that can bring light to others. To protect everyone's privacy, names, locations, and certain details have been changed while keeping the heart of the story true. If this story moved you, please like it, share it with someone who needs it, and don't forget to subscribe to Calm Girl Stories for more. Thanks for watching.